Welcome to the Long Shortway podcast. Thank you so much for watching or listening. My name is Mendy Bistritzky. I'm the Chabad Rabbi in Saugus, California. And my hope is that this podcast, and that this episode specifically, help you along your journey, help you along your way. If you'd like to support this project, there's a donation link in the show description. I'm sitting here with Rabbi Mendel Zirkind, who is a well-respected rabbi and educator in Los Angeles, soon to be in Melbourne, Australia, as well as a dear friend. And I'll leave out all the other honorifics because I don't want to make him too uncomfortable over here. Thank you so much, Rabbi Zirkind, for coming out.
Thank you for having me. It's a big honor. I'm looking forward to this. I watched your last episode. I thought that was amazing.
Thank you.
And I hope this plants some seeds that sprout in ways that could be helpful, perhaps to others, and trigger some thoughts by others, and take us on a journey that is has at least a hope for a destination.
Amen. Or it helps us remember maybe that the journey is the destination.
Right.
In which case, as long as we start walking, we're there in some level.
Yeah.
Or maybe we can get back to that later. Okay, I wanted to start here. In knowing you, I know you as someone who's very much a free thinker, an independent thinker, someone who very much tries to find the truth on your own terms, in your own way. And at the same time, you're someone who's deeply rooted in halacha and Torah law, in not only learning Torah law, but being a rabbi who guides others in Torah law and teaching Torah law. So what has your journey been in the process of navigating that tension between your own individuality and your own pursuit of truth, while also, in a sense, surrendering some of your own sense of identity in pursuit of following what God wants and forgoing some of that?
It's a loaded question.
Yeah, I figured we'll jump right in.
Yeah,
with
hit the jugular. So let's maybe go back a little bit. I'm part of a family that halacha is very prominent. Besides having, grown up in a family of rabbis, rabbonim, my father and his father. In general, the atmosphere at home was very much within the spirit of following halacha and having a sense that what's important is, the final say is halacha. Much debate took place in the house centered around halacha. So I grew up in that atmosphere, and there's no way that I could really look at myself today and say that hasn't played a huge part of who I am. I think, though, at the same time, I grew up in an environment that was also somewhat balanced between halacha as being, as I said, like the final say on things, and also a certain open-mindedness to explore, maybe limited exploration in terms of halachic exploration, but there was still an open-mindedness. In other words, the sense of, this is what it is, just because, some rabbi said that, wasn't, the idea of this sense of Kabbalah soil, as we call it, this sense of that I have to just follow because that's what's been, said. It was not, that wasn't the atmosphere at home.
So what was the approach to halacha or Torah law?
If you were able to prove it, there was a lot of argument, a lot of debate. My father with his father or siblings, even, with us as kids, children, if you were able to prove your point, you won. Obviously, when it came to an issue of where there wasn't really, definitive proof, so then you could, it could get loud, and I'm talking serious, loud.
All for the sake of the Torah, obviously.
All for the sake of the Torah. Really heated. I remember once share an interesting anecdote. It was Sukkot, so in our house we have our sukkah in our front yard, and so it's open to everybody, and my father, Olav Hashalom, and his brother, should live long, got into this heated argument. And this is outside. And it escalated, and it was getting really loud. Now, my father was hoarse, but yet it was loud. The neighbors next door actually asked us, should we call the police? That's like to the extent of like what it sounded like. But that was typical, So I grew up in that environment of like, you don't just accept. And I think in my house, with my siblings, there was a sense of, obviously, we follow Torah, mitzvahs, halacha, but there was always discussion, always a discussion about things. I find it also interesting that my mother, she should be well and have a long life, she grew up in Australia for her first 18 years or so, her father being the chief rabbi and head shliach, emissary of the Rebbe there to Melbourne, Australia, grew up with a very strong feeling for Yiddishkeit, a very strong emotional thing. So there was a very interesting kind of dynamic between, the Zirkind academia and sort of like shrewd, objective, analytical approach, and then this emotional, like deep feeling towards Yiddishkeit. And that played a major role in my life. But with all that said, I will still say that for myself, I feel that there was much of what I explored on my own that I think has really brought me to where I identify myself today. So just to give an example, I never felt part of everyone else. I was never like your typical, boy growing up in the school system, going with the flow kind of thing. I was never someone that sort of just followed the herd. I was always, I don't know if I want to use the word free thinker because that's a little bit radical, I think, to say as a child, but I definitely liked exploring things for myself. I definitely did not like authority. I definitely did not like this closed-minded mentality by some, highly independent.
How did that play out in your personal relationships with kids your age, or did you find your people?
So this is quite interesting. I was always put up on a pedestal. I was always looked up to. So I never really had friends. I never really had I wasn't seeking it really either, to be honest. But I never had like this kind of like relationship where I was accepting from someone else and sort of like, receiving from someone else. I was always, whether it was because of, being on top of the class or whatever. So I never really had that kind of social dynamic in school. At the same time, I grew up, we looked a little different, for those of you familiar with, the Zirkinds and the way they dress and,
It's funny because someone who isn't Chabad, we look 99% the same, but when you're immersed in the...
Yeah, if you're not familiar with the Chabad, culture, I guess, and the Zirkind fitting into that, it was, to use the big word, the abused word is not that far off. So in school, it was always a challenge for survival. To be honest, I never felt my place in school, although I did do very well in school, and because I was always looked up to, and that brought about with my classmates having a certain inferiority complex, which I only really began to appreciate much later in life. In my 15, 16-year-old, I realized like how they felt towards me. So I never really had that kind of dynamic in school. During recess, I wasn't the kid who played around in sports most of the time. I did do a little bit, but I was more the one who sat, hung around my teacher and kind of like that kind of child. And at home, it was an overwhelming dynamic. It was an overwhelming dynamic at home. I felt, I had older siblings that were well established, well accomplished, and where was I? I didn't feel like I fit in even at home, really. So I never found myself fitting in anywhere. I built a tremendous deep connection with my grandfather, alav shalom, which really played a major role in my world. I mean, he was a very dynamic person. He was brilliant. He, besides being an expert in Torah and covered all the pages of the Talmud and knew it by heart, and the Jewish code, Shulchan Aruch, and all that, he knew tremendous amount of secular knowledge. There was really no topic that could not be discussed or that he didn't know about. And it was just, literally you could sit there by the table and just like breathe in the knowledge, information. And that was a huge inspiration to me. And that's where I felt safe.
It's so interesting because my question was, how did you kind of navigate that tension or the friction between giving yourself over to halacha or Torah law and kind of self-expression or finding yourself? But it sounds like for you, they weren't two separate things. You were just like on a journey, kind of an independent journey toward finding the truth, discovering the truth, and understanding it on your own terms.
Yeah, very much so. I feel like my childhood, being that it was tumultuous in many ways, without getting into details and specifics, just from what I even shared till now, there were many different avenues sort of to go down. And what I valued the most was knowledge and free thinking. And because I didn't see halacha as this rigid system, I was able, although I should obviously say that those, listening and know the Zirkinds and know sort of the way they're strong about halacha, it may sound like, what do you mean? Like were brought up in a very religious home and a very strict home, which is all true. The final say was halacha, as I said, and I did challenge that. I remember telling my father, after I sort of grew up a bit and started learning myself, I said, I used to think everything that we do is, stringencies, and I realized it's based on something. And it gave me a deeper appreciation for that it wasn't just, this wild, being strict kind of, OCD in being religious and having this, obsession about it. It actually was grounded in actual, halachic reasoning. And I valued that a lot. So I saw halacha as being something that is much greater than just the final say. But yes, I would say that I was always seeking, I was always looking, and I was always trying to make my own identity out of it, which I still am trying to do.
So how does faith factor into that? Like transcendence, and I could define, if you'd like me to, but to, self-transcendence or giving oneself over to Hashem, to what they call a higher power, to Hashem, being a follower, a chassid of the Rebbe. In other words, so strongly pursuing your own truth, how do you transcend that in pursuit of a truth that's beyond yourself, beyond your own reason and understanding? Or you can plead the fifth. Okay.
Now, I want to talk about this because I think this is very crucial. Obviously, this is, I would say, this is I don't know if the right word here is conundrum, but this is the inner tension that I still deal with. And I don't think it's a bad thing. Faith, however you define it. I always have identified within myself these two polar opposites, which I can't make sense of. I have my very strong analytical, independent, rational way of thinking. And then I have this, like, what I like calling my, intuitive side. I'll share again a quick anecdote. One of my students from the past, while I was in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, he once asked me, he says, I don't understand you. He says, when it comes to, when you teach, you give a class on whatever it was, whether it's Gemara, the Talmud, or Halacha, you always, present it in a very philosophical, like argumentative way and, challenge maybe certain ideas and all that. He says, yet when you study the Tanya, the book of the Alter Rebbe, you sort of just seem to accept it. Like, not that you don't explain it, but it's almost like you say, this is the truth. Like, how do you do that? Like, why aren't you questioning it? And I said, I don't really have an answer, but this is the difference between these two sides. Like, I have this very strong, forced sense, I don't know if force is the right word, but very strong force, not force, but force of, a drive to understand and make sense of everything. On the other hand, there's this deep sense of intuition that really governs the way I perceive the world. And I've done a lot of soul searching. I've done a lot of analytical thinking and introspection to try to find where faith lies in my I guess my identity. I can't really answer that question from, I could share suggestions, but I can't answer that question. When it comes to specifics about faith, like you said about the Rebbe, my relationship and all that, I struggle with that also. I feel staunchly connected with the Rebbe, and all major decisions I do is through the Rebbe, whether it's by asking my mashpia. I do believe in writing into the Igris, which is another one of these irrational things. But I feel very strongly connected. But there are things I question. There are things that I have a hard time with. And I would say that I don't find that as a contradiction. I don't believe necessarily that my job as a chassid is to fully, hook, line, and sinker accept all of the Rebbe's, explanations of things. And I don't know if that's what the Rebbe wanted. So I would say that I don't think it's a lack of faith in that sense. I don't know if we're putting it in the category of faith, but I would say that it definitely has these two sides, how they merge together.
Do they merge?
So they do on some level because, first of all, the Rebbe was, in my mind, a brilliant thinker, a revolutionary thinker in many ways. And the Rebbe does have an explanation for things. It's not like, the Rebbe was just in the books. From almost any topic, you have the Rebbe discussing it. So just from the academic, intellectual side, I think that you can't not just that you can't ignore the Rebbe's approach, but you also have to admire it and value it from that perspective. We're not talking about a Rebbe now being, some holier, superpower, but we're talking about purely as, as whatever we could understand of the human mind. The Rebbe was exceptional in that. So that pulls me into what the Rebbe has to say on things, just from that point of view. Then when I look at the Rebbe from a perspective of Rebbe and the concept of Rebbe and this concept of, well, you're not meant to really understand. So then I have like this, obviously this, what we call bittul, right? This, I like saying bittul is, incorporation to something higher, this transcendence of something beyond yourself that you don't necessarily know what it is, but you feel compelled to just, be part of.
Here's the important question. Why don't you like translating bittul as nullification?
Because that's not what it means.
As the literal translation.
So, there's a little story to that also.
I just want to explain a little bit. Nullification meaning to nullify oneself to God or to give oneself over completely, nullify oneself to, to the Rebbe as a leader, things of that nature.
Right. Here's the thing. The word bittul didn't originate in Chassidus. The word bittul comes from, even in Tanya, right? In chapters 9, chapters 10, 11, where it uses the concept of bittul, it's used in the halacha context. That isn't to say it doesn't have a unique, context and connotation in Chassidus, but I think that the word bittul in halacha means be quite straightforward about it. Halacha says that if you have a pot of meat and some milk falls into the pot, so then the milk becomes bottle. What does that mean? That the milk becomes nullified? That's ridiculous. The milk is still there. It didn't just evaporate into thin air. So rather, the milk becomes transformed into something else. It becomes incorporated into something else. It becomes part of something else. It's no more the milk, right? And that's what I think bittul means.
So how do you, but if you're pursuing truth on your terms, what is the process of bittul, of this incorporating into something higher? What does it look like? What does it mean? As much as you can articulate. Or is it letting go?
I think when a person is in a space where they're seeking, they're not. Well, let's differentiate between two modes of operation. You have, let's say, conceptual thinking, where you're trying to understand an idea and you're trying to connect to an idea. And then you have, introspection thinking, sort of, where you're trying to understand yourself and you're trying to understand how you fit into the world. I think you can't do that without bittul. What I mean by that is that you're not an entity of itself. You're an entity part of a larger picture. When I was dating my wife, so we one of our dates, we went to we went to the Brooklyn I think it was the Brooklyn Promenade. It was near the Hudson River, whatever it was, and we were just watching the waves, and I just was, I expressed at the time, I'm like, this is just an awesome experience where you just see the mighty power of the river, the ocean, and like there's a sense of like you just want to be part of it, like you just feel connected to something much greater than you. Which, by the way, just parenthetically, I think that's one of the problems today is that we're not in raw nature. Like if we would really be in nature and just be living in that openness of nature, you would feel bittul, because it's just something that is a force of nature that you can't deny.
Yeah, I always say, like, having a phone, one of the challenges with having like a phone is that it gives us the illusion of control, where we don't feel like we're given over to something beyond ourselves. You can pick up your phone and learn Chinese. You can pick up your phone and start a business, like on a whim. Yeah.
It's interesting, one of the major realizations, it's a bad word to say, but about WhatsApp is that everything, it's not just WhatsApp, everything today is like the speed you play back on, and people say, like, please don't send me a voice note. Like I can't, like the 30 seconds, you can't listen to the 30 seconds, right? We have been so programmed to things, but yet we feel so in control of that, like you're saying, that it has played in the way where we're even capable of just living within what nature really is. So I'm not going to listen to the full 1 minute or version. I'm going to have to listen to the 2. Not that there's something bad about that. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but what I am saying is that it's a great indication to something to what you're saying, which is that we're so far removed from the natural. And we're so, enslaved to a created reality that we think we're actually controlling that reality versus it's controlling us. But just getting back to the bittul for a second, to me, again, if you're thinking from a conceptual point of view, you're trying to understand the concept and idea, that idea becomes an isolated idea. So when it's an isolated idea, you need to be sort of the one in control of that, because you're trying to understand it. It's sort of like measuring, a particle or a wave that, as you measure it, you identify the particle, and, the wave length collapse, and you become like, you're then sort of creating, maybe is even to some extent, or forcing a certain identity of the concept. There's no bittul in that. But when you're introspective and you're looking at yourself and you're trying to understand the world and you're trying to understand your place in the world, it forces bittul. That's my version of bittul.
It's also interesting because, again, as I was framing before, as a tension between your pursuit for truth and you transcending yourself and having bittul and trying to incorporate yourself into something higher than yourself. But maybe it's acknowledging the paradox and how these two simultaneous truths are part of the journey, are part of the long, short way in a certain way.
Absolutely. This is one of my, I shouldn't say mine, like talking about bittul, right? Using the word mine, it's like, but one of the ideas that I strongly connect to, that like sort of hit me, a long time ago, is this very notion of paradox. To me, that's God.
Could you explain a little more?
Well, just let's use an analogy, right? Let's say I'm observing a show, or I'm looking at a piece of art, and I have a certain take on it. And you watch the show or look at the piece of art and you have a take on it. And our views are totally opposite of each other. How do you explain that, right? Is one right or one wrong? No, they're both right. It's obviously the way we're personally taking it in and how we relate to it. That's the truth of everything in nature. And even within ourselves, we have to recognize that there are different facets, and we look at the world very differently through those different lenses, those different facets. And what we recognize is that the tool of logic is just that, it's a tool. And I'm going to observe the world through that term, that tool of logic. The tool of intuition is also just a tool. I'm going to see the same thing very differently. And not only differently, but paradoxical, because that is the identity of truth. Truth cannot be yes or no. That's not truth. Truth has to be, I don't want to say the word universal, but I want to say all-inclusive. It's not one thing versus something else. So in that sense, yes, absolutely. This harmonizing of, let's say, faith and reason, or, free thinking and bittul, is really very much a recognition that both are sharing and conveying different views, different shades, different expressions of the same truth. Even they contradict, because contradiction is not let's not say the word contradiction because that isn't the correct word, but even when there's the paradox, I think that's when you actually know that you've hit a core truth. Give an example, right? When a person, let's say you get married, there's nothing that makes sense about getting married. I think if a person is very honest with themselves, they'll recognize there's absolutely no reason to get married. Okay, I'm not talking about people who get married for selfish reasons, or, I'm talking about marriage for what we understand.
Or for the tax benefits.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I'm talking about marriage from the point of view of like, this is a commitment to something and a dedication, a relationship and all that. It makes no sense. Why would I do that?
You're saying to forgo your independence.
To forgo your independence. You may like the person, you enjoy their company, they give you something, but then there's such a pull to it that says you're not going to live your life without it. So how do you explain that? Well, you don't. That's the truth. That's what marriage is. Yeah. It's that pull of wanting something that is perhaps unreasonable, irrational. And that in a way that's what perhaps we could call the mystery. That is what we're really seeking in life. Mystery is a paradox.
It's interesting. We've spoken about this, that I think a gateway to appreciating how Hashem is found in paradox is through acceptance, through recognizing how everything's coming to me from God. Not even getting into the specifics of God is good, just acceptance. Everything's coming to me from God. In the words of the Baal Shem Tov, Shivisi Hashem lenegdi samid, equanimity, recognizing how it's all from Hashem. It reminds me of a story I'll share briefly. There was a chassid, a follower of the first Chabad Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, in the late 18th century. And he came once to the first Chabad Rebbe and he says, Rebbe, I'm struggling with faith. So the Rebbe says, go to my colleague, the Karliner Rebbe, I think it was Rabbi Shlomo of Karlin. So he travels to the city of Karlin, and he walks into Rabbi Shlomo of Karlin's synagogue shul, and he sees Rabbi Shlomo pacing the floors. And he walks in, and this Rabbi Shlomo, this great righteous tzaddik, he turns to this Jew who's struggling with his faith, and he says, young man, maybe there's a God in the world. And all his doubts vanished. He comes back and he thanks the Alter Rebbe. So his colleagues were talking about, why did the Alter Rebbe have to send him to Karlin? Why couldn't he have told him, maybe there's a God in the world? And the answer they came to was because by the Alter Rebbe, by the first Chabad Rebbe, he couldn't even say maybe, because it was so certain, it was so clear. And I wonder, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, like maybe the gateway into appreciating paradox, gaining that certainty into everything being from God, from Hashem, is starting to accept the paradox. Maybe it's all from Hashem. And that's the gateway, that's the foot in the door into faith, into embracing the paradox of life.
Yeah, I mean, you shared a story with Alter Rebbe. I'll share a story. I don't recall all the details. Perhaps you do recall. But I have to remember where I heard the story, so I shouldn't be quoted on it. But the story sort of goes that someone asked the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Chabad Rebbe, that perhaps he heard that he made a comment or something was said, or he believed that there was an idea that all ideas in the world are found in Torah. Sort of like, all isms and all ideas in the Torah. So he says, where is the idea of atheism in the Torah? Or like that there's no God. Or is there? Not where is there, but is there? And the Reb Rashab said, yes, that there is the concept that God doesn't exist. Now this is the way I remember hearing the story. And for me, that was a very profound, important, tidbit, life lesson.
Like the Torah leaves room for the one who's doubting, who's trying to discover.
And even deeper yet, the very notion of existence, if we get a bit philosophical, is a construct of man in many ways. And therefore, the same way we say something does exist, we could say something doesn't exist. And the Torah doesn't define that existence in one way or the other. And that's the paradox of it. Existence is a paradox. If a person is fully honest with themselves, especially today, if I dare say post-Kant and this school of thought that we really don't know anything of itself, we only know, the phenomenal. We don't have, knowledge of the nomina, of the thing in itself. Like, do we know anything exists? And I think that is the sense that we have that there is existence, which may be false or not, and the knowledge that we sense that there isn't existence is the paradox that we live in. Another example is, we know we come from our parents. We don't sense we come from our parents. But how do we put the two together, right? So yeah, I think like in that sense, I think that is, answers your first question, or the question you asked about faith and reason.
How so?
Because I think that for me, this concept of paradox is the root. Because I think the reason why people struggle, if I could at least, it's conjecture on my part. I can't give an answer for everybody and psychoanalyze everybody's motives. But I think partly why there's such a tension between, faith and reason and all that. And you have so much, ink, written, pages of, written words that try to analyze and make sense, and you'll have this person's take on it and that person's take on it. Does it contradict? Does it not contradict? Is all because there's an inner tension of, I need to know something with certainty. We have this notion that we need to know for sure. And if I don't know for sure, then like, in a way, I admire the agnostic, but not for the reasons the agnostic will think. It's not because they say they don't know. It's because we don't know. It's precisely because if you say you do know, I think you miss something. Obviously the wise man saying, the ultimate knowledge is the knowledge I don't know, right? Some attribute it to Socrates, and there is in the Jewish philosophy books, it says B'Shem HaChacham. Who is that Chacham that said it, right? I think in Rabbi Yosef Albo's Sefer Ikrim, he quotes it there. Tachlis idea shaloin de de'achal, but like there it's referring to God, obviously, that we don't know God, but in truth we don't know anything. And I think not that we don't know as a certain ignorance. We don't know because we recognize that whatever we have a perception of this way, I can have the very same perception the other way. And that in itself is also, if I go a step further, is the fallacy of reason in itself. The fallacy of reason is that people give too much credence to reason as if reason provides certainty. It doesn't. All reason does is provide a reasonable explanation. Now, granted, in the realm of reason, I would say this reasonable explanation seems to be more reasonable. So let's say the question about evolution versus the Torah's version of existence and how we came into existence or whatever. There's a very good reason to say that evolution is more reasonable, but all that is saying that I have a certain construct that I work with, and therefore I choose this explanation or something like that. But also recognizing that the very same tool of reason could tell me the very opposite. If I argue the other side, I'll have also a fairly good, reasonable argument to be made. Now, why am I going to choose one over the other? It comes down to feeling confident and feeling secure and feeling a sense of safety. And when you're looking at safety, we feel like that is what, that's where the sense of confidence comes from. That sense of safety makes us feel that we need certainty. But when we let go of that and we're ready to sort of become an ultimate true free thinker, then we embrace paradox and we embrace agnosticism from the perspective that I really don't know. Doesn't mean I don't act. Doesn't mean I don't behave. Do I know when I married my wife, that this person is going to be the best person, for 120 and beyond? That's ridiculous. It's because you don't know is precisely what propels you there. So I think that for me, that is definitely a very important foundation of why faith and reason are not, it's not a contradiction, it's a paradox.
And at the end of the day, what you think faith is rooted much in your intuition and you accepting
well, I wouldn't say
that it resonates.
Yeah, I wouldn't say accepting from a place of, I sort of like give up and say I have no other choice but to accept this. I think that if we just talk about intuition for a second, you'll Google intuition and they'll tell you, creative patterns in the mind and things that you've already experienced. And now when you have a new experience, you sort of, connect it with all the other experiences and all that. That's sort of a psychological definition of intuition. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about perhaps an epistemological intuition, which means epistemology is the study of trying to know something. And how do I know something? What gives me any grounds on anything to know anything, which is really the question we're discussing right now. And I don't think there's any tool out there better than intuition for that. And the simple reason is because if I do use Kant, I don't think there's any way of knowing anything. So what are you left with? If I say that I can't know for certain anything, and I'm living perhaps in my own mind's creation of something, my subjective reality, well, guess what? That very subjective reality also has a process or a system to it that, whether I create it or not, is there. And whatever that process is, intuition plays a huge role in that process. So, and I think if I could say, Kant was addressing intuition from that point of view. And I only bring him up because I very much strongly, in my own journey, prior to reading his Critique of Pure Reason and prior to sort of delving into the what other philosophers say, but I sort of very much came to this idea I shouldn't say on my own, but it very much resonated. And then reading a lot what he said, it just clicked. And to me, I think that you're trying to use reason to know, and you cannot use reason to know.
Yeah, it's almost like uncertainty, like I was saying before, is a gateway to faith and to trust and to connection to Hashem.
Yeah, and we all know this to be true from the very classic phrase, "There's no atheist in a foxhole," which to me epitomizes this point, because you won't find God by feeling safe. It's when you're in the foxhole, and you will have this staunch atheist that'll say, on the contrary, when I'm in the foxhole, I just, recognize that there is no power above or whatever. The power of reason is very powerful. It's an extremely powerful tool. And it plays tricks on us. I mean, if I could go down this path for a second, the power of the mind in general is very powerful, and it plays tricks on us. And we perhaps think we know something, and then we realize we don't. it really, I may be speaking a little bit in riddle over here, but I think there's that point of recognizing that I don't want to say acceptance. I don't want to say even where to let go. To me, it's almost a philosophical truth. It's a reasoned truth. I did a series of classes on this, which I uploaded to Spotify. Something I call like epistemological theology, or so I don't remember exactly.
It's hard to
title.
spell, so I'll put in the bottom.
And where I sort of go through this process, and the objective of the classes were to sort of use as much of reason as we could to ask the questions, right? If you don't have questions, then you don't have anything. So you need the questions. And what I argue, I think it's really convincing, if I could say, is that reason will connect with the intuition. So I guess I'm focusing on this point because I think a lot of people sort of get caught up in, well, your intuition says one thing and my intuition says something else. I don't know it's true. I'm not talking about intuition as an isolated entity. I'm saying intuition and reason do merge together. And I think that's very important.
Beautiful. So we'll jump now because you're speaking about very deep ideas about faith, about Hashem. But much of what you've done for the past, I think, 15 or so years is to teach in yeshivas, particularly to yeshiva boys who haven't found success necessarily in their previous yeshiva, so they've gone to what you call an alternative yeshiva, or whatever the right word is. What do you find in terms of what these boys need that you try to address? What have you find as the best guidance, if there's generic guidance or whatever it is? And number 3, why do you think you relate to the boy maybe who's struggling or is finding his way? And then if you can just give the background of how you ended up in this role.
Maybe we'll work backwards.
All right, go ahead.
How did I get into this role? I have no idea.
I'll try to remember all the questions, but we'll go from here.
Right. I mean, each question really is a conversation.
We have time.
Right. I guess briefly, let's just go a little bit to the history on my end, and then go to the more important question of what perhaps teenagers need today. I think that was the first question.
Or what they're struggling with.
And what they're struggling with. So I when I was 21 years old, I finished, I got my rabbinical ordination, and I sort of was planning on continuing that in Israel, and then I got fairly sick with hepatitis, so that had to be put on a pause. And then the year sort of dragged on, and I wasn't really, the person I planned to learn with, he already got engaged, kind of thing. So 21 years old, and I'm at home, and I didn't really have any plan. And a friend of mine calls me, and he's like, there's this place, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and I had no idea, I never heard of the place. They're looking for someone to come to maybe, teach, smicha, the course that one takes to get rabbinic ordination. And will you be interested in maybe, trying it out? So I said, why not? I'll give it a shot. So I met Rabbi Perlman, who was the dean, director of this yeshiva, and he was in town. I was living in Crown Heights, and he was in town for whatever event it was, and we had a very nice conversation. And to me, it was more like, okay, I'll give it a shot. I had no aspirations to get into education. I know, I mean, in camp, I was a counselor. I was a learning, I had ideas. I wouldn't deny that. I'm a thinker, I guess I could say. I thought about things, but I never had an interest in going into this field. Although my campers would joke and say, you should open up your own school, which I'll get back to, because that was actually my first experience really with dealing with, they weren't even teenagers yet. They were like 12 years old, my class, and they were like your typical 12-year-old camp kids who are not interested in anything, and learning time was just, you're the scapegoat for all the problems because you're the learning teacher. And learning that was a tremendous life experience, and we really bonded. I bonded with all of them, and even till today, still have a connection with a lot of them. But so going back to Wilkes-Barre, so I started, and it's sort of the first few months I was there, I didn't find much into it. I right away built a relationship with the students there, and they would ask me questions, and they were dealing with a lot of, things, let's say depression and anxiety and faith-related questions, and just overall trying to pick my brain on things. And I remember sitting and having these long conversations. And for me, that was like being that open-minded person. This was the space I needed really to explore for myself. So it was a sort of like a give and take on both ends. But I didn't necessarily find my place in it. In fact, the following year, I didn't even go back. But then they asked me to come back, and sort of that's really where it began. And I never really identified myself with it, and I still have a hard time identifying myself with it.
What did you find there?
To be honest, I find it very meaningful. This goes to your third question, which is, I guess, how do you feel like you related to them and all that? I think the sense of someone struggling and recognizing as an outsider their potential is something that motivates me and inspires me to try to help if I could. That I noticed from day one. There's a very interesting statement that Chazal, our rabbis, say that, Hashem mevakesh nirdof, God seeks out the underdog, and I relate to that. I mean, God, relate to that, but you have to try to follow and emulate God. But like that sense of someone who wasn't given the best chance.
But do you, as much as you're comfortable sharing, do you relate to the underdog as well? Because in school or in the environment you were in, you were kind of like on your own in a certain way.
Yeah, so definitely my own childhood plays a major role in that, for sure. I mean, in school it had one connotation, at home it had a different connotation. As I sort of said earlier, I didn't feel comfortable in any one of those environments. And that definitely played a major role. I mean, primarily at home, where I had my older siblings and all that, and they were, well established. So I didn't necessarily feel I fit in very much. I struggled with that a lot.
How do you, where have you gotten to with that today? We'll get back to yeshiva. With that sense of not fitting in. I think it's one of the big ironies of life is that there's so many people who don't feel that they fit in, and they think everyone else feels that that person fits in.
Yeah. One of the early stages of what I think happens is you begin to question yourself and say, are you the crazy one or are they the crazy one, right? And that's a very tormenting experience, to really ask yourself, who's normal? And most people, 99% of the world is going to say you're the crazy one. I must be the crazy one because I'm not fitting in, and there must be something wrong with me. Especially when it comes to family dynamics. You don't have any objective view. So whatever you're told, whatever you're made to feel at home becomes your reality, becomes your truth. Very painful, very sad, very destructive. That's in a way more traumatic, not to minimize anybody's trauma here, but that is more traumatic to begin to believe the labels you were told as a child and to really identify with them. And for some people, they stay with it their whole lives.
So how did you untangle?
It's been a process. I don't know if I fully untangled, to be honest. I think that there's a lot of me today that is completely still attached and entangled from there. Recognizing the strengths of those things is what I try to do. And not everybody, I would say, had the opportunities I had, which was to be in a place like a Wilkes-Barre and Jets, where you're speaking with students who have gone through similar experiences or even different experiences, but a lot of times it's the underlying, way they felt. That is very therapeutic and allows, for someone like myself to be able to self-reflect from an objective, because you are now forced to respond. So how do you deal with it yourself? I've done a lot of soul searching. I've gone through a lot of phases in this process. I remember I wrote pages. Not that I've shared it with anybody, and I probably don't want to share it with anybody, but I wrote pages. I'm just trying to understand myself. Freud, they say about Freud that he went through like 4 years of psychoanalysis before he became, Freud or whatever. I would say that I've gone through 50 plus years of psychoanalysis, but I went through a period of hardcore psychoanalysis. And that's actually, if I could say parenthetically, turned me off from psychoanalysis. Realizing that I don't know how much good it's doing me.
I wonder if that helped you learn how to have bittul, to incorporate into something higher.
Maybe, right. Yeah. I mean, part of the journey of psychoanalysis is that you think you could help yourself. And you sort of think that the deeper you probe the issue, the more control you have of it, the more you could fix it. Which is, I'm not going to say entirely not true, but not true. What you do need to recognize is the realities, the facts, not the reasons behind the facts. But yeah, I would say that for myself, going through the journey I went through as a child and not feeling like I fit in. And that really changed. I go back to a point. I guess I'm being very vulnerable here, so
we can edit it all out.
No, I guess there's a point to go there. If it helps someone else, I think then it's worth it. I mentioned before that in my house, the sense of, academic achievement, in the sense of the pressure was enormous. To be top notch. I would come home and I didn't get the 100, so it wasn't like, oh, you got the 98. It's like, why did you get a -2? And I'm sure many people relate to that. But it was just, as I mentioned about my grandfather and my grandmother, who had 4 degrees, 4 master degrees, and my father being brilliant, and just the whole atmosphere was the pressure was enormous. And if you weren't like this, you were out. You felt like you were out. You had to be an overachiever. It wasn't just like you were good in school. You had to stand out. Something special, something unique. And that's hard to do. And it's even harder to be recognized for it at home. But my year of smicha did that. When I got back, and the smicha I did was a very rigorous...
the rabbinic ordination.
The rabbinic ordination in Melbourne, Australia, was considered, doesn't exist anymore, and was considered the top line smicha, at least in the Chabad world. And I did it very well. I did very well on it. And that gave me a new respect at home. It may sound superficial, but it turned that kind of it was a turning point for me. There was a lot, though, that happened before and after, obviously. But not without that, I would say that I probably wouldn't be where I am today. I needed to find recognition, and I needed to find my place in my own house.
And in your own soul, probably as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was lucky to have the last few years of my father's life to really talk to him in a way that I felt, we're very similar, and he, in many ways, understood me from a perspective that I don't think anybody else did or does, perhaps. And that was very meaningful. Too short, but very meaningful. And those were the crucial factors, besides a few others. My mother is amazing, We kid around in the family, go to therapy, my mother's the best therapist. Quite literally, she's incredible. I'm very lucky in that regard. So, and my family, we're an incredible family. As we grow up, we're just, our connection, our bond, our love for each other is just amazing. So, yeah, it was very tumultuous, dealt with a lot, but over the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of healing from that. That has been very, very rewarding.
It's so beautiful. It's also like, I think, you talk about the tumultuousness or the chaos, like there's something and not to minimize any pain or anything like that, there's also something beautiful about taking that chaotic energy from the past and integrating it, the positives, into one's character, into helping others. I don't know if that resonates.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Whenever I speak with someone, the first thing I try to do is relate to that person. Where do I experience or have experienced something that they're going through, have gone through? I can't help them otherwise. If I can't relate to them, it doesn't have to be exactly the same thing, but there has to be something there that there's a connection. If I can't find it, I know I have to pass this on. And that is very much to do with in that sense, I'm thankful for my childhood experience. I would say if I wouldn't have my childhood experience, I would probably be a lot more isolated, a lot more in the cave, lost and engrossed maybe in the books.
A lonely man of faith.
Yeah, very much so. Like this ability to become much more within society and to be a productive member of society and helping people is definitely as a result of that.
Well, we're really blessed to have you in society.
I appreciate that.
But so in terms of the yeshiva boys, or I think teenagers at large, it's a lot of crossover in terms of the challenge. What do you identify as a lot of the challenge? I mean, obviously we're going to generalize, but in general terms.
Well, there's different. In my years of experience, there's been a shift over the course of like 15 years. Like when I first started, there was a lot of anger
from the boys,
from the teenagers. Very angry, very frustrated. Felt like they've been abandoned, And now it's almost like there's a complete apathy, a complete disinterest. And I think there's many different reasons for that. One of the biggest reasons is because we've become so psycho-conscious today. So parents don't know how to parent anymore. They're going back to intuition. What one would argue is the best tool a parent could have is their own intuition of how to treat their child has been gone, because you have a million podcasts telling you how to be a better parent. And I'm not saying they aren't helpful. I'm not saying there isn't value. And not every parent, my brother has this line. He says, not every child is born with a manual book, it's true, I was in Melbourne, Australia a number of years ago, and I was doing a talk, and I met a few of the people after the talk. So there was a father and son there, and this is an older couple, the father must have been, I guess, in his 80s. His son is maybe in his 60s, 50s, whatever. I don't remember exactly the ages, but he says, "Oh, this is my oldest son." He says, "You know why in Torah a oldest son gets a double portion? Because you mess up double with your oldest son."
The guinea pig.
Yeah. So like at the same time that I'm saying that, intuition, obviously it's a learning curve, and obviously there's a lot of good books and all that, but the problem becomes when we stop thinking for ourselves and we stop being intuitive to our own knowledge. And I try to tell this to parents. We have to empower parents to be parents. And that's something that is extremely difficult because you think you're going to mess up your child. And the result is there's apathy because the parent do not create what I like calling healthy tension at home.
We'll get back to apathy in a second.
Yeah.
To push back, wouldn't you say there's also, a lot of people or teenagers, in any society, or in yeshiva, wherever it is, would you say that trauma is a significant factor in a teenager struggle? In other words, you're saying apathy is a big challenge. Is trauma not the primary role or a very, very big component of a teenager's struggle?
So let me say a few thoughts I have about trauma. And the first thing about trauma is that you can't conceptualize trauma. We use the word a lot today. What that is very subjective. For what one person goes through and is identified as trauma, another person could go through the very same thing and it wasn't traumatic. So it's too subjective and too difficult to pin down. That said, there's no doubt that trauma plays a major role for some people. But I would like to say that the biggest trauma is neglect. Not just neglect in the sense that, God forbid, a parent ran away and left the child. Neglect can mean a parent being afraid to parent. To me, there's like there's these two extremes: the parent that's the overly aggressive helicopter parent, and this like strict disciplined parent, which the parent feels like they have to sort of mold their child, which may be a bit what we call old school today, but still around. And then we have the parents that are like calling themselves, we're hands-off parents. That extreme is what we're living through today. We're living through a watershed. How we turn out is going to be a big question in my mind. There's so much going on in education and parenting, but like this moment we're living in right now is really going to define the future of education and parenting. But because we have these polar opposites, so what happens is a child that's, being helicoptered has no mind of their own. They're being squashed. They're being, they're being traumatized from that end. And then the parents who are backing off or hands-off parents are neglecting their child because the child wants to be directed. The child wants their parents to be parents. The child doesn't want their parents to be a friend. The parent doesn't want their parents to say, it's okay, you try, figure it out for yourself. I want the guidance. I've never met a teenager that didn't want guidance, that doesn't want to be held by the hand and told how to do. Maybe there's a way to say it. So I think if we're going to speak about trauma, we have to sort of see the bigger picture here also, which is, yes, there are obviously people that have gone through very severe traumatic experiences, and those need to be treated properly, and those individuals need to get help. And I encourage anyone who has that trauma in their back, in their history, go seek professional help. Don't expect that to sort of just,
take care of itself.
Take care of itself. But I also want people to acknowledge that trauma could be just a lack of guidance, a lack of being parented. It's like letting a tree grow wild. How do you think the tree is going to grow? Wild. No direction. And I've seen more of that in different, and there's not one way. In other words, there's many different variations of that. Take, for example, a parent who's too busy because they're trying to, bring in a livelihood, a parnasa, and not meaning anything malicious. They're just not there for their child. That's neglect. Or the parent that is very busy helping everyone else, but when it comes to their own children, they have no clue. There's different variations of it. But what I found is that when the parent is not present, for whatever reason, I think that affects the child the most. Now, we do have to put in place, people who are abused or people who went through like severe trauma. That is a different story. I wouldn't say that's most of the teenagers today. Not that there isn't, I'm not trying to, God forbid, if someone feels like they were, and I'm not creating categories here. I'm just saying I don't think that's the most. I think the majority of teenagers today, on some level, feel parent neglect. Or the biggest way of describing it is, my parents don't get me, don't understand me. And a lot of it has to do with, obviously, the culture. I mean, we're moving so fast culturally. We're moving so fast. Our parents lived in a world that's far different than ours. And us being parents, which is the scariest thought, right, are going to live and are living in a total different reality than our children are growing up in. And it's not, 100 years ago, there wasn't that much difference. Like the parents of 50 years ago could relate, I'm saying 100 years ago could relate to their children much more because there wasn't this huge gulf of technological, cultural, there's a new fad today every other day. And teenagers today, obviously the biggest thing that eats at them is social media and the need to be famous, the need to, you could go on YouTube and become a YouTuber and become overnight sensation. And every teenager dreams of that. It's money, it's fame, it's everything. It's validation. So, but why are you seeking that? Okay, I think any teenager will seek that because teenagers in general are going through a difficult time. I mean, that's what teenage life is. But if there was a healthy grounding as a child, a healthy support as a child, I think a child will feel a lot more comfortable in their own skin, that wouldn't feel the need that they have, that feels so overwhelmed by that. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a number of different factors here. There's the parents, because I think that parents are afraid to parent. There's too much information in that sense. I think there's also the fact that parents don't necessarily relate to the child because it is a total different reality in many ways. And parents need that bittul to recognize that. At the same time, they still have to be parents. And that's talking about paradox, it's really the same thing here as well. And the third factor is obviously the sense of validation that a teenager, today, telling a teenager, let's say, completing the entire, Talmud. You have a few. I'm talking about, obviously, a religious teenager. How many of them get too excited? Tell them, you could become an overnight sensation on YouTube. It's like, and so.
It's hard to embrace the long, short way.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Right. Very much. Right. You hit the nail on that one. Right. That's really what it is. It's the long, short way. And what I've discovered over my, I guess what I'm saying here sounds very, very general. But what I'm trying to convey is the fact that I'm not putting responsibility on one party over another. I think obviously there's different factors, but I do think that there's obviously a lot of external pressures for things, but the parents and their inability to truly relate and feel safe to relate, which is even more important, really is probably the biggest factor.
I don't know, I just remembered there's a very special Jew who I didn't know, but I heard really special things about, Rabbi Yuri Dukes. I don't know if you knew him.
I'm not sure if I knew him, actually. There is a chance I did know him. I'm actually, whatever.
He lived in your city. Yeah.
Yes, he did. I have a reason to think I actually knew him very well, but I'm not sure. I'll tell you why later.
Okay. So anyway, he, very sadly, he passed away during COVID. I was living in New Haven then, and they had online a video of his with the Shloshim, the memorial service. And I don't know, it was late at night. One of my kids was up crying, one of my babies at the time, and I was watching this memorial tribute, and it was just the most touching, amazing thing about this shliach, this person dedicated to the Rebbe's ways. And one of the videos, you talk about parenting, he was, someone who ran a division of a Chabad project called JNet, where different Torah study partners would study on the phone together. And they had a lot of videos about his impact and how he arranged Torah study partners for many people and everything. And then as one of the videos, it's him with his son, and he's on all fours on the grass, and his son is on his back, and he's like, going on all fours, crawling with his son on his back. His son was like a toddler. And his son looks down and he says, "Tati, faster, go faster." So he turns back, and he's this respected rabbi. He says, "I'm a slow hippopotamus." And I was like, that's my hero, man.
Yeah.
Talk about safe and engaged and...
Yeah. It's, and it reminds me of the story in the Torah with Yaakov when he met up with his brother Esav, and Esav wanted to walk with him. So he says, "I can't walk too fast because my kids, they take a longer time." Yeah. I mean, I don't want anybody taking this as I'm sort of simplifying it. It's very dangerous when you simplify things and narrow it down to a single ingredient or a single variable. I am not. I'm saying there is a huge array of things here. But I do feel if there is something that I would want to change is empowering parents to recognize that having a healthy tension, Now, you have to be a healthy individual. It starts, being a healthy parent means a healthy person. If you're not a healthy person, you can't be a healthy parent. Now, that itself becomes a problem because there is the intergenerational trauma. There is that, where our parents may have not really treated us well, so then we don't have the ability to really be there for our children. And there is a huge clash because the previous generations, especially post-Holocaust, didn't know how to parent. I share this thought. It's a painful thought to say, but I say that, Hitler didn't just kill 6 million Jews. There's the survivors of the survivors. And if we put that in perspective, that's a lot of what us parents today are dealing with. Now, not everybody's parents went through the Holocaust, but it was a rough time. Even if you were in America, your parents went through the Great Depression. You didn't know if you're gonna have food on the table. Survival, and when you're living with a generation post-survival, you don't really parent. You don't have the space to parent. And now, where it's peaceful and calm,
and there's abundance.
We're trying, but we're afraid. And I feel that we need to, yes, it's good to learn and read, and we should read, we should, listen to others, what they have to say, professionals. But you also have to filter out for yourself what you understand and what you know to be true about your child. There's parents that try really hard, but they listen to a million different people. They'll right away call up, their child is suffering, is struggling. They'll call up 10 different people and they hear 10 different opinions. And now the child is more confused because the parent tries to implement all the 10 different views. It just doesn't work. So there's a certain balancing a parent needs to have. I do want to add one more variable, which I think is very important. And that is especially, talking to the teenagers that we're involved with are, mostly grown up in a religious home and have gone through the system. I said before that I didn't have any interest really in education, but there was one thing I was very passionate about. The system is good for nobody. And I know this is a topic that everybody, could jump in on and everybody's, you just...
Well, I guess to be more precise, I guess if you could be more precise on...
When I grew up in the system, I didn't feel it was catering to me anything special. It didn't provide me an ability to express myself, to feel safe in who I was. It wasn't catered to me being able to learn about myself. It didn't teach me how to learn. It didn't give me the skills I needed to learn. It was almost like expected. You sat and learned long enough. I remember speaking to a respected educator, and he's like, you have the students sit there in front of the Gemara, the Talmud long enough, they should pick it up. I'm like, no, that's not the way it works. It's like if I sit in front of a book of Chinese, it doesn't all of a sudden mean I learn Chinese. It's not the way it works. I need to learn the skills. And this is another major factor. You come out of the system, you think you're a complete failure because you don't know how to read a Gemara, you don't know how to read, Jewish text, and you think you're stupid. And you're not. You're brilliant sometimes. You just weren't given the skill. So they don't provide the emotional support. And you could argue that's not what an educational system is there for. Arguable. You could argue the point. Although I disagree, but I hear the argument. But you don't need to provide the education. So there's a system in place. Okay, at this age you learn this, at this age you learn that. And then we try to compensate for the younger, weaker students, quote unquote. And then you make the stronger students have to come in line with the weaker students because we're not going to do the other way around because we're more knowledgeable today. So we don't want the weaker students to feel, so now who are you really helping? Nobody. Because the stronger students feel bored. The weaker students are not given the skills because you're just watering it down without giving them what they need. So it's just a vicious cycle. And there's been a lot there has been a lot of investment in trying to change this, and there's been a lot more awareness. And I'm not saying that, it's all bad, but I think at least and one could argue that the teenagers that we're involved with are a small percentage, although I would argue that They're just the ones that actually finally said, I had enough of the system. And there's many more like them in the system. And even those that are, quote unquote, flourishing in the system, I sort of think that they could do a lot better. And I think that's a very important variable. So, like I said about myself, not feeling comfortable at school or at home, it really goes back to the same point here as well. Like, I think a teenager today growing up, like, school didn't provide them a sense of confidence, a sense of, that they're accomplishing something, a sense of, personal validation. And they come home and the parents don't know how to react to that. And so therefore they send their children to therapists at 10 years old because they have anger issues.
What talk about untangle or do tshuva to let's say if a parent wants to make up on lost time or things like that, what's the way to engage and to heal that?
One of the things as a parent is the ability to be open. I think some of us get it and some of us appreciate it. The ability to be open means that you sit with your child and let your child tell you you're the worst parent in the world and you don't defend yourself. There's nothing to defend because your child is not criticizing you or lashing out at you because they don't like you. You don't have to worry about their love. They're seeking your love. You start defending yourself, you lost them. And that's the first thing. And I've seen a lot of parents that don't know this, that they don't understand that it's not about defending yourself. Not that necessarily you're wrong. It could be that you did everything right. There's no point in your child having you defend yourself to your child. First of all, your child is going to lose respect for you. They're going to think you don't understand them. So I think the first thing is the ability to listen to your child and absorb a lot of punches. Obviously, we're talking about a child that's already, struggling and does have already things that have been piling up. Another factor of a parent is where the parent has the ability to convey a sense of trust, where the child feels that the child has reword this for a little better. There's a lot of times that the lack of trust starts at a very young age, and to rebuild the trust is the hardest thing. And part of the rebuilding of the trust that a parent needs to do is the ability to relate to the child from a perspective of what could I do as a parent that will make my child feel safe? And what I'm trying to say is that I've had conversations with parents, and sort of the conversation goes like, well, you don't know how difficult he was as a child. Okay, your child knows that. He senses that that's the way you felt about him or her in many cases. So the child doesn't feel safe around you. Like, they don't like me. They don't want me. I was a mistake. I shouldn't have been born. My parents hate me. So there's one thing where the parent just like accepts hearing that from the child. There's another thing where the parent begins to recognize that the child wants to feel safe with their parents. A trust, a safety. I don't believe in this concept of, what do they call it? Twisted parenting. This may work in severe cases.
Right.
I think there's maybe value in, but parents should not become the friends of their children. That's not what a parent is. The child loses any sense of safety around a parent like that. It's just awkward. It's uncomfortable. There's nothing wrong with a parent being very loving and showing a lot of love, but the parent has to remain a parent.
So if there's a parent has their kid's still relatively young and this, that, and they choose to, give their child that healthy tension. They learn with their child, they push their child, to learn more, to help others, etc. I think that's pretty straightforward as to how to incorporate that healthy tension, that push. obviously with a backdrop of unconditional love and trust and safety. In your opinion, how does one give their child that sense of healthy tension when their child is struggling? Or do you first rebuild the trust, rebuild the safety?
Yeah. So I don't think that you could create a healthy tension for the child at this point. If the child is broken, like the Rambam speaks about, the golden third. When you're dealing with an issue, you go to the other extreme. You can't expect that all of a sudden, now. So I think that parents that are dealing with children at a very young age, the healthy tension that I'm referring to is where the child feels encouraged, but yet senses that they could do more. Encouraged in the sense of it's not about how smart you are, how good you are. It's more about the objective. So that was clever. That was kind. I think when you make it more about the objective, the object that the person is working on as a child, you provide a sense that there's more to do here, and there's, but there's yet a validation. So an encouragement here I was referring to like a certain validation, but not a sense of you've maxed out. And one of the things I try to incorporate in my classes and my teaching style is I could be very, very tough on my students, where I could be very demanding from them. But at the same time, there's also a sense of I appreciate who you are, where you're at, what you're struggling with, and I try to validate you from that point of view. I sort of separate that between the classroom and out of the classroom setting. And I think parents need to do the same thing. You have to create the space of where the child feels that you understand them and validate them.
And they're respected. And
loved, obviously. And then there's another environment where you're pushing them. That's that healthy tension. If you've lost that, if it didn't happen that way, whatever it is. And again, a parent could say, I've done that and it didn't work. Obviously, there's cases like that. I mean, again, this is not one size fits all. And there are kids that get traumatized. Obviously, there's things that happen. But overall, I think this is a fairly safe thing to say. If we're just isolating the family dynamic, the home dynamic. But if you're dealing with a child that's already, lost the trust and doesn't feel the parents understand them and all that, it's rebuilding. It takes a lot of rebuilding. Parents just have to let go of their own ego. And I'm sure they've heard this. I'm sure people have heard this.
You're telling me something too hard over here. Anything easier, or that's the...
There's no way to be a parent when it's based on your ego. And we sense it in ourselves. Even just the fact that we could get angry at our children is an ego thing. Why are we getting angry? They're children. You're not feeling safe yourself, which is a kind of ego thing. So because you don't feel safe yourself, you react just like a child. So you're no more the parent, you're the child again. And then the child says, that's the way to behave when you're not in control. And you act the same way. So it's a tremendous demanding factor on the parent. And you could make mistakes. No child goes, free from parents' mistakes. But if you have the ability to sort of own up to that mistake.
Yeah.
And not always try to excuse yourself.
But not to be apologetic.
No, you don't make the child feel like you're not the parent. You always remain the parent. You listen to them. You absorb what they have to say, and you embrace them. Sometimes they don't want to be embraced, which is another thing. Parents think if I just embrace them and say, I love you, they don't want that. They want you to say or recognize you messed up. And that's another important thing, because it's very easy to just hold the kid and hug them. But you didn't do anything. You didn't heal the wounds. You didn't rebuild the trust. You suppressed it. You shut it down. And you made the child feel suppressed, shut down again, neglected. Let's say a child that reaches out to their parent and wants to share, a past memory and says, I remember when I was a child, this and this happened. And the parent was like, oh, really, I feel so bad. I feel so sorry, that you went through this and all that. That's nice, but it's not what the child wants to hear. The child wants to hear is like, yeah, I probably messed up there. Not because you did. Listen, parents are entitled to mess up, but that's not what the child needs to hear. And it takes a lot of selflessness to recognize that, and a lot of ability to recognize that you still remain the parent with that. Because the next statement is, how do we rebuild this relationship? So in that sense, the relationship always has to be predicated on parent-child relationship. But doesn't mean a parent has to remain, this
aloof or
yeah.
So it's like I'm hearing three things of like there being a strong sense of safety and trust, giving that healthy tension, and then there was a third thing that slipped my mind. So it's somewhere in the other. But
yeah, I mean, the parent intuitively sensing what it means to be a parent and believing in themselves and trusting themselves. This is obviously before they mess up. And even if they do mess up, right?
This was the other thing. I think I gleaned it from your words, and you'll correct me if not. But the other thing that I realized kind of recently was I think it's really important for our kids to know that we take them seriously. Not necessarily that like they say they're going to be an astronaut. Not necessarily they're going to be an astronaut, but that what they're saying is valid. What they're saying is their own. If that makes sense.
And at 5 years old, they are going to be an astronaut.
Right.
I've seen my child go through these phases. First he was the policeman, then he's the fireman, then he's the astronaut, then he's the army man. Like in each phase, that's what they are. And sometimes as a parent, you feel like it's almost like you need to make the child know that don't get stuck in this reality. Don't worry, they'll grow out of it themselves. They don't need you to crush it for them.
Yeah.
To destroy that reality.
I think for our kids, in a way, they on the contrary, like when you allow it to get it through their system, that's how they can move forward.
Yeah. And I think also it's not the end of the world if the child doesn't behave in school.
Yeah.
A lot of parents are freaking out. Because my child is not behaving in school. There's nothing wrong with that. In other words, they're normal. They're healthy. They're not doing well. Okay, sometimes we try to figure out what the problem is, but maybe the teacher's not a good teacher.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not the child's fault. Or even if it is the child so what do I do as a parent that provides a sense of safety for the child, but yet I'm still the parent? Like going to the other extreme, a lot of times the child comes home and complains about the teacher or whatever, and the parents are like, yeah, that teacher was, and you just lost being the parent. This plays out in so many different ways, but it's
okay. I want to transition now.
Yeah.
The night is yet young still, but I wanted to ask because I think most of the people are going to see this. Obviously, I'm going to shout out my mother, who's God willing going to see this. But our Frum, our Orthodox, our Chabad is my assumption. I want to ask you more specifically to define your connection to the Rebbe and how you work on that connection. The more quote unquote objective ways, the things that you do, and then kind of your internal relationship with the Rebbe, as best as you can.
Externally, what the things I do, I try to live up to the Rebbe's expectations of me, if that makes any sense. Obviously, the Rebbe's instructions, learning the Chumash of the day with saying the Tillim and the Tanya, and the Rambam. Unfortunately, I don't do it as well as I want to or have done in the past. Thank God I have 3 kids, and these are excuses. Enough said, right?
Yeah, you learn it.
Yeah.
You're supposed to learn it,
Yeah.
not say it or do it, as the distinction that I heard, yeah.
I used to always criticize people who say, I do chitas. You don't do it. You're supposed to learn it. And these days, I think I end up doing chitas a lot more than learning it.
I'm going to throw a little bit more into the question, is that I think there's a lot of Chassidim who, especially born after Gimel Tammuz, after the Rebbe's passing, who struggle with, I mean, there's objective metrics, the Chitas, the Rambam, which, I'd love for you to continue to enumerate. In addition to that, this like internal relationship and experience of relationship with the Rebbe, with our leader, with our guide, with our spiritual father.
So this really goes back to the beginning, right? I'm I very much connect to the idea that the Rebbe, my soul is connected to the Rebbe's soul, right? This is a very, Hasidic idea, and it's an idea that's actually quite, not that it's not spoken about before, Hasidus and Hasidus Chabad, but it's very much highlighted, the role of the Rebbe. And in that sense, the Rebbe being, as described in Neshama Klolis, which means that the Rebbe is the soul that contains all souls. So I guess the analogy will be like, I'm aware of when my foot hurts because in my brain there's a neurological connection to my foot. In that sense, I'm a toenail of the Rebbe. And in that sense, pretty much what's described in chapter 2 of Tanya. And I relate to that idea. Not just relate to it, I kind of, with all my, intellectual doubts about certain explanations and ideas that Rebbe conveys, that doesn't take away one iota from my connection to Rebbe as Rebbe. To me, as I said before, any major decision, anytime I'm going through a tough time, I always turn to the Rebbe. And I've seen the Rebbe's guidance. This sounds very irrational to say, but, like if someone else tells me, I've seen the Rebbe's guidance, I'm like, yeah, you sure? What are you on? But for me, it's reality. I've gone through this. I've seen things.
I told you recently how fascinating I find it that the way you write to the Rebbe's Igris, to the Rebbe through finding an answer through one of his putting it in a book of his letters and opening it up and finding a letter and finding guidance.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable in my mind that I do that, because it doesn't make sense. And objectively, there's a lot to question about it. And I always do question, especially when I don't get the answer I want. But to be honest, I've seen so much. And at one point you have to say, is this just coincidence? Or is there something real here? And if you believe in the concept of a Rebbe, and you believe in the supernatural, so to speak, in the metaphysical, if you believe in the idea that there is a greater dimension to reality than we perceive, then it all ties together. I don't have to go through, or maybe I do. I don't know if the point here is to share stories. But obviously I grew up in a very Hasidic home. Again, it's interesting because my mother was sort of that life energy of the Hasidic home. My father wasn't obviously a Hasid, but like growing up in the family, we lived in the same house, the same building as my grandparents, who were a little bit of a different form of a Hasid. They weren't your, what we call today, your spitz, they weren't at all. And they questioned a lot. Like I said, there was a lot of openness, And I really struggled with that, I guess I still do maybe, but I really struggled with like, is the Rebbe like infallible or no? But I grew up with a sense that I could question that. But at the same time, I grew up with a tremendous connection, a lot from my mother and my father, but more from my mother in that sense. And then as I grew up, this idea really resonates with me. And for me, being connected to the Rebbe on a deep level, means that I'm a foot soldier. I know this is cliche, but it really means that. Like I'm not making my life decisions based on what I want. Like even my future move to Melbourne, as you mentioned.
We'll get there soon.
Yeah. This is not my choice. Not that I'm against it. At least, obviously, I'm not against it because I'm doing it. But I'm not doing it because this is what I want to do. I'm doing this because I believe this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And that's because I feel like I've gotten direction from my mashpia, which I very much believe that the Rebbe conveys his wishes through the mashpia, and from getting answers. So for me, it's very real. I live with it. I live with it.
So if I would ask you, what is Rebbe to you? If not a full answer, then a partial or...
From an emotional point of view, I could say the Rebbe is my mother and my father. Although my mother and my father take a very deep place for me also, but there's that element. It's not the mother and father like kind of idea. I know you hear these statements, of Chassidim that say, the Rebbe is my mother and the Rebbe is my father and all that. I'm talking about from experience.
A spiritual mother and father.
A spiritual mother and father. Getting answers that spoke to me directly. Feeling, I'll share one story. This goes back quite a while, quite a long time ago. My father at the time was struggling a bit financially. He was working. He was, he's an accountant, but he decided he wanted to only do work in chinuch, in places of, still be tied to,
the holy
things, right? And they weren't paying him well, whatever, every chinuch organization struggles with that, right? That's one of the telltale signs of it. As I once heard someone say that, the longest running Jewish institution was the yeshivas, I think, in Nardo, Pumbedisa. So he says, could you imagine the deficit they had? And that's where the Shadals came, and the whole idea of sending people to collect money. It's all to do with that. But anyway, so my father never made us feel like there was any struggle financially at home. But I'm a type of, I was aware of it, and it really bothered me. So I wrote into the rabbi. I wrote a letter, and I said, my parents are doing what you want them to do. They're listening to you. So why are they struggling? Why did I, It was like a sort of like a complaint. And I opened up, and the answer I got was, firstly, don't worry. It'll be all taken care of. Which is what happened. Literally within a few months, my father got a new job within the same place, but whatever, which was being paid by the government, and that changed financially majorly. Which, just to mention it, like he was able to pay up debts, and when he passed away, we were pretty much debt free. So it was a huge, huge bracha. But then the Rebbe basically, was being the parent, and he said, "Where's your faith? Like at the end of the day, how could I hear you, but like, where's your faith?" And I felt that was very personal. I remember sitting with a student, and the student wrote in, and we had a talk. It was before Yud Shvat, right? The day of the previous Rebbe's passing, the day that the Rebbe accepted being Rebbe, and we had this whole chat. I think you may have been there. It was in Jets a few years ago, and there was this whole talk about Yud Shvat, and I made a big thing about writing into the Rebbe. And I shared, I think, a little bit of my own stories, and one of my students came over and said, I always write in and I never get an answer. I said, okay. And he wrote in this time. I think everybody wrote in. It was quite remarkable. And it was incredible answers. And I sat down with him, and I started crying because the Rebbe gave him an answer. It was clear. The Rebbe was talking to him. And like a father, not like a, this is what you should do because I'm the Rebbe. By the way, the Rebbe never did that. The Rebbe never told anybody to do anything. It's quite remarkable. I mean, I should, obviously, I'm saying it in a way like the Rebbe never told. I mean, in letters, the Rebbe is telling people, I suggest this is maybe, except for if it came to something that his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, said. Everything is like, and I've seen this over and over and over again. So when I'm saying this idea of the spiritual father and mother, I'm talking from experience, not just idealistically. I don't know if I would have related to it idealistically. So from that end, the emotional end, that's what the Rebbe is. from an intuitive place, the Rebbe is the guiding light of who I am, of where I'm destined to be in life. I don't know who I'm supposed to be. I don't know where I'm supposed to be ending up. How am I supposed to know? I mean, that's what we all struggle with, no? So for me, I could try to think and come to some answer, conclusion myself. I'll be doing nothing. But the Rebbe tells me. And I've seen, again, through experience, that every step I took, I'll share another example. I was, as mentioned, in Wilkes-Barre for a number of years. And then after my father passed away, I sort of completely lost any interest in what I was doing. I lost all motivation. It's interesting, till I met my wife, it's sort of like I was dead. And I was really not interested in going back to Wilkes-Barre. And there was many different factors why I even went back. My father passed away in before Pesach, in the month of Adar, so there was still a few months to go. There's a lot in that why I went back, But the next year I was like, I'm done, and put together some, married guys. We're going to start a koil in Crown Heights, which happened. It's currently running. And
So for married guys to sit and learn with a stipend, yeah.
Yeah, and that was my, that's what I was going to do. I had questions. I wasn't, obviously totally sure, but I wrote, but before I met the guys. I said, we're going to start whatever it was, Tuesday, but I have to write in. I have to get an answer. I wrote in, and the answer was pretty much just that you think that, you're going to go to kollel and you're going to enjoy and have more learning time for yourself and all that. That's not your job. Your job is to deal with the youth. That's more important. And there was a number of other things that happened at the same time, which we don't have to get into now. And I remember I was speaking there with my mother, and I was very disappointed. I didn't want that answer. It was very hard for me to accept. And I remember, my mother saying, don't you see the blessing that you're being guided? How many people wish they knew what they're supposed to be doing in life? And I met my wife through that in many ways, because my students were eating at the house of my wife's uncle's sister-in-law.
It's such a Jewish story.
Yeah, and I guess somehow my name, they're, will you learn? My teacher, and started, singing my praises, I guess. And I got the perfect girl and all that. And I just see, like, realistically, my life would have been a totally different place if I would have taken that position. I don't even know where I would have been today. So, like, again, these are, you could talk about it from cliche point of view, sort of, idealistic point of view, the words that you repeat that you hear from other people, which I'm totally not a fan of. This is experience for me. So emotionally, it's that father or mother. And internally, I mean, intuitively, it's that internal direction, that compass of my being. Now, do I live up to everything that Rebbe wants of me? Probably not. Are there times where I'm like, I struggle with faith? I struggle with faith on a daily basis.
The Rebbe is providing you that healthy tension.
Yeah. And by the way, that's another major factor of why, to me, one of the great things that people don't appreciate is the openness the Rebbe does provide. One of the things people talk about is the Rebbe is like very strong, pushing, let's say one of the things people today question is, I bring it up a few times because I know this is something that people really struggle with, is the Rebbe's expectation of parents having a lot of children. And I don't think the Rebbe is demanding something that we can't do. I think the Rebbe is trying to lift us up and push us to a place that we should try to strive for higher and better. And the Rebbe, at the same time, does have the room and the space to say, well, maybe not for you, or maybe not yet. And I think that's important.
It's interesting. There's this fascinating book, and then just to give you a time frame in case you have to run soon, but I would go for 2 more hours. We have that, but a couple more minutes on this, and then we'll go to your move, and then we'll wrap it up for this segment. But there's this really fascinating book, I think I shared with you, of someone named Meir Abasera, who was a Baal Tshuva. He became Frum, he became Chabad, and he was the one who would whistle at the Rebbe's Farbrengens, at the Rebbe's gatherings. So he has this really, really interesting book about his journey. He's a very spiritual guy. So he says he was in Morocco growing up, and he's playing a game with his friends and his brother where there was this marker, like this line in the dirt, and he had a marble, and he had to hit a marble 10 feet away. And they were all going from the line and going 10 feet away. And when it was his turn, he took 5 steps back, 15 feet away, and he figured, if I hit the marble, it's I made it. I'm really something special. If I miss, I'm 15 feet away. What's a big deal? He says, I'm about to throw the marble. My brother says, no, go to the line like everyone else and throw the marble from there. It's fascinating to me to hear, for yourself with the grappling of the paradox and the journey, and how the Rebbe's, constantly in the parable pushing you to the line and saying, no, like, and enter the world of action, and you'll discover yourself in many ways there.
Yeah, I mean, just to that very line is something I live by. It means with all of my, I guess you could say, intellectual pursuits, with all of my doubts, with all my questions, with all of this, sort of behind the scenes, I recognize very strongly that without the action, without just doing, you're lost. And that's a message directly from the Rebbe. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like, for whoever's still listening over here, I think it's, for myself as well, it's been the biggest thing for myself in terms of, like, Yetzias Mitzrayim, leaving my own limitations, is reaching out to others and helping others and guiding others and sharing mitzvahs and good deeds with others. Absolutely. Okay, last subject over here, and then we'll have to do part 2 some other time. In terms of your move to Melbourne, Australia, you're moving, God willing, at the end at the beginning of right after Tisha B'Av, so in August.
That's the plan for now.
Yeah. We can edit that out if that changes, but but middle of August, whatever it is, and you're going to be the rabbi to guide the Chabad community in Melbourne, Australia, God willing, and Bezrat Hashem, you'll do a great job and continue your holy work. I have no doubt. What are, for yourself, your biggest, I guess, challenges you see, either within yourself or in the role you're stepping into? And what are your primary goals in terms of taking on the mantle of being a rabbi of that level of leadership? So challenges and then goals and ambitions.
I mean, and the challenges on a personal level are the ability to fully be there for the community. I am more by nature an introvert, and therefore this thought of having to be fully invested on a 24/7 basis to a fairly large group of people seems very daunting and overwhelming. So to me, one of the challenges is the ability to, I guess, just flow with that. I don't know how it's going to turn out.
Well, really stepping into the role of being a man of action.
Yeah. So that's one major challenge. Another major challenge is being that the community is very diverse, and there's a huge age, spectrum, how to bring that together. I don't expect everybody to embrace me at any point. Definitely not in the beginning. I don't expect, or maybe some people embrace you in the beginning and then they, it's gonna be challenging to create a trust, as we spoke about before. It's no different. Being able to be there and show a sense of care and a sense of healthy tension
for the community.
I've never been in this role on this scale, and I don't know what that really looks like. It's sort of like getting married. I think marriage is still a notch above, but it's like getting married without really knowing what you're getting into. So in that sense, those are some of the challenges. I would say another major challenge is the fact that you really have to have strong convictions, very strong convictions. You have to be grounded in what you are. And if you don't, it's going to be clear to the community. It's true of a parent, it's true of an educator, but on a community level, it has more consequences. So I think one of the challenges is for me, whatever I have strong convictions of now need to be as strong, if not stronger, when I take that position. Why that's a challenge is because you're faced with pushback from that. And you have to really navigate what do you really think is the truth and what do you really know to be the right approach. Obviously, you have to listen to other people and get guidance and, listen. But that strong sense of conviction of what's right and what's wrong. So that's, I guess, what you say is the challenges. What was
and the goals?
So the goals, I would say the major goal for me at this point is to provide the community with a sense of an aspiration to grow internally. I think, unfortunately, there's a lot today of where we sort of mentioned it before. There's a certain a sense of I'm good where I'm at, and by the way, I'm not saying that is true of the community. That I'm not referring to a specific community. I'm just saying in general, there's a truth about that, and there's a certain apathy we have, and a certain
inertia also, just like that.
Yeah. And I want to instill a sense of we need to try to go out of our comfort zone. We need to try to strive for something higher, something more, in all facets. Whether it's learning Torah, whether it's fulfilling, mitzvahs, really connecting to God. And I think one of the goals I do have is sort of perhaps maybe trying to be a little bit more of that non-conventional rabbi, where perhaps the conventional rabbi of a community is, the one who guides in a very, more narrow mind. Again, you have this spectrum, you have this extreme, either you're old school or, where Torah, halacha is of utmost importance, and sort of the human side is not so important, or people's questions and people's doubts. And then you have those that focus too much on the human side, and therefore Torah and halacha sort of get thrown out the window. I would like to try to create a healthy balance there, where there's a sense of the fact that Torah and halacha is our guide, but the human side is very important. You may argue religion is a very human thing, and if you don't have the human side to it, you don't have religion. Just having a dogma, a very dogmatic, approach is not what God wants. God wants a relationship, and you can't have a relationship with God without feeling that you exist as a person in it. So that's a goal I have for myself, for my family, for whoever I'm in touch with, and I guess move it to a bigger scale in the community.
Amen. Last thing for you, and then I'll have some closing thoughts. What are you, if there's someone listening, anyone, a yeshiva bacher, a community member, whoever it is, if you were to suggest something to learn, some Torah, something that really inspired you or shaped your relationship with Hashem, with the Rebbe, what would you suggest to learn?
The Tanya.
I had a feeling that would be the answer.
No doubt about it. I grew up in this system, and I never turned to Hasidus. I didn't like it really, and I only once I started learning the Tanya myself, and I really began to sit and think, and I would learn the daily Tanya, and I would say, how does it relate to me? And I wouldn't leave until I found the connection to it and something personal, and it really shaped my life in many ways. It really took me in a different trajectory. I wasn't interested in religion, so to speak, when I was younger. I was religious to some extent. I wasn't as they would say, typically off the derech. But I wasn't necessarily a strong religious individual, and didn't necessarily, the Tanya really had a major impact on my life, and it still does. And I think that if someone is looking to learn bittul, to learn that there's something greater, to recognize that life isn't just my reason, isn't just, the statistical, scientific reality that everybody presents it to be, and to find my inner truth and to feel like I know without a question of, am I, being honest or dishonest and all that, but being able to tap that space behind that. I think the Tanya is a meditative work. It's a work to a journey into my deep space, which is what I think Hasidus really is in many ways. It's informing you about yourself that you're unaware of. The analogy I like using is like learning how to drive a car. When you first get into the car the first time, there's so much you have to become aware of because you've not been in that environment. And then once you become aware of it, it becomes second nature, it becomes part of your intuitive process. The Tanya is awakening you to things that you just never paid attention to, and on a different dimension. And when you become, when you sort of drive through with the Tanya and you go on the journey, they become second nature. They're like, this is reality. And then, not that you don't have questions, not that you don't have, certain doubts and all that, but the insecurity part, the safety part, which we spoke about before, to a good extent, to a large extent, becomes faint. It's very faint. It doesn't go away completely, but it's very faint. And I would say Tanya is the book to learn it properly. Beautiful. Meaning learn it with something that is going to give you the real Tanya.
And ask yourself, how does that inform my life, change my life?
How does this speak to me? Because there are abstract concepts in the Tanya, but it does speak to you, and it's something important.
In the second section of Tanya, it's the gates Shayich Vamuna, all about the very abstract ideas. The beginning of it, the Alter Rebbe explains, if I remember correctly, how his goal in teaching this is so that it infuses us with a sense of faith.
Yeah, I mean, there was a debate, it seems like, whether to write that first, because without understanding and knowing what you have faith in, how do you build a relationship? Because the chapter 1, the first book, the Likutei Amorim, is all about the relationship. One of the ideas that Tanya struck me, and just to throw this point in, is right, what we call the Sharplot, the opening page of the Tanya, where the Alter Rebbe describes what his objective here in the book is, and he says, this book is here to explain to me, talking about the long, short way, and the short, long way is to explain to you in a long, short way how the verse that says, Ki karv alecha davar ma'od, that Judaism is very close to you. And you could go away with the book of Tanya like thinking, really, is it close? And it's not so much of a question versus a statement. The argument that's being made here is that this is you. Right? The Alter Rebbe is not telling you, impose something on yourself. This is you. This is a Jew is Judaism. They're one and the same. And your responsibility is to discover that. That's all you're doing. Kikar v'lecha means this is you, and you therefore need to discover. And I'm going to show you how to discover that. So that's why I think Likutei Amorim is actually in the beginning, because it helps you discover that before you get into the realms of faith, which in the Rambam, for example, that comes first. The love of God comes afterwards. But yeah.
Fascinating. We'll just about end here. I'll share that our families, I think, go back sometime. But one thing I realized, a connection between the Bistritskys and the Zirkinds, is that my grandfather, when the Rebbe would give wine to the Hasidim on Motzei Shabbos on Saturday night, from his cup to give for a blessing, for a bracha, he would pour wine. My grandfather would stand behind the lines of thousands of people passing by the Rebbe, and my grandfather would make sure the line was moving, constantly move people along. And it was your uncle or your grandfather?
Uncles.
Your uncles who stood when the Rebbe would give out dollars to the Hasidim to give to charity and to give the people who came a blessing. They would push people along. So,
well, I actually have a personal connection with your grandfather.
Oh, really?
I don't know if I shared this with you.
I'll finish this thought, which is that we should continue pushing ourselves and others. And then, please, when the Rebbe was unwell in the 1990s and 92, 93, for whatever reason, your grandfather took a certain liking to me. And
at times he would, let me in to the, what we call, the Gan Eden HaTachten, place of where the Rebbe, right before the Rebbe's room. And I felt very, it was very special to have that connection to I didn't really know your grandfather from any other perspective, but for whatever reason, I had that relationship with him.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so that's special.
Okay, you still have a drive, so we'll finish up here. Big thank you to Corin Young. I hope we didn't keep him up too late. He's a dear friend, and his production company is called Video Bump Inc. He does a great job. Highly suggest him. Give him some good holy work. Corin's the best. If you'd like to reach out to myself, you have my email in the show notes. If you'd like to support this project, and we'll see where it takes us together, there's a donation link in the show notes. You could also email me, or if you have my number, message me on that. And then we will find a way to have a way to reach Rabbi Zirkind. I won't give your phone number, maybe an email number or something for someone who's looking for the healthy tension or someone to speak to, or for some guidance on what we spoke about, or how to contend with your doubt, whatever it is, a way to reach you. And
Sure.
Thank you again so much for coming out. This was...
this is special.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you.
I think I hope it was insightful for some and guiding maybe a bit for some, but most importantly, to stir up conversation about these very important topics. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, and hopefully, like you said, hopefully we inspired a few people or motivated to do an extra mitzvah, to fabring a little harder, and to come closer to
recognize
Hashem.
that it's a long way, but at the end of it, it's
well worth it.
Well worth it. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.